All right. So it looks like our numbers are starting to stabilize a bit, and it is 7 o'clock here. So I think we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Janine Higgins, and I'm an engagement and education specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks, and I'll be the facilitator for our session this evening. So to start off, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am speaking to you tonight from the traditional territory of Treaty 6. I'd like to recognize that we are coming together online from traditional territories and homelands of many Indigenous peoples. And I'd like to acknowledge the treaties of this province, as all of Alberta is treaty land and we are all treaty people. I acknowledge the long history and the deep connections of our First Nations and Métis that have with this land, and I honor this today in hopes of working together in a good way moving forward. So for our session this evening, we are going to be going through a bit of a welcome just to introduce you to the Zoom platform and how our session will be run for this evening. And then I'll be passing it over to Mike Blackburn, who is our senior fisheries biologist, who's going to take us through a presentation on the Upper Pembina River recovery rest period before we move into our question and answer section of the evening. So we will be closing off the meeting tonight at 8:30. So for our Q&A, depending on how you're joining, if you're calling in from a phone or if you're on a computer, you should see on your screen, either on the black bar at the bottom or along the top of it, a button that says Q&A. And if you click on that button and open it up, that's going to start the Q&A function for you. And so if you have questions throughout the presentation this evening, you can type them in there. And we are going to be using the upvoting tool tonight as well. So if there are questions that you see that someone else has written that you'd really like to hear the answer to, you can go ahead and click that button and it will help us to be able to sort through the questions. So in terms of what you are typing into our question box tonight, we'd like to remind you to keep it clean. I'm sure it won't be a problem for this evening, but any inappropriate questions will be deleted. And if we start to see a lot of repetitive questions or things that we've already responded to, we'll just be dismissing those. So the upvoting is just one tool that we're going to be using to categorize our questions in terms of what we're responding to this evening. But we may be grouping questions together if they're all of a similar nature. And we're going to try to answer as many broad questions this evening as we can on the topic of the Upper Pembina fishery. So we're also going to be starting off our Q&A section with some of the pre-submitted questions. So when you registered for this evening, you were able to submit some questions in there. And hopefully Mike's going to answer a whole bunch of them throughout his presentation, but we'll be starting off with some additional questions as well. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel. So as I've already mentioned, Mike Blackburn is our senior fisheries biologist who's going to be our lead presenter, who you'll be hearing from shortly. We also have Ryan Cox, who is our area fisheries biologist, along with Mike. And then Kadon Wilcox is here. He's our manager for the Northwest. We've also got Shane Petrie here, who is our fisheries policy manager. Nicole Pilgrim is also joining the panel, who is our species at risk biologist. And we have John Elias, who's here from Justice and Solicitor General, our district fish and wildlife officer. He's joining us from the field this evening. So thanks, John, for being here. And then, of course, myself, Janine, and I've also got my coworker, Jenna, here. So Jenna's going to have her video turned off. She's going to be working in the background, making sure that everything runs smoothly technical-wise, and looking after some of those things. So she's not necessarily responding on the panel, which is why she'll have her video turned off. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Mike for our presentation this evening.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight to talk about the Upper Pembina River. I hope what I'm presenting tonight you guys find informational, and hopefully we can answer quite a few questions tonight and let you guys know what's going on with the Upper Pembina. So first we'll start off with why we're actually here. So in 2014, we recognized that the Upper Pembina River Arctic grayling population was at very high risk of disappearing from the watershed. So in 2015, we consulted with Indigenous communities, provincial regulators, public stakeholders, and tried to come up with a plan to recover Arctic grayling in the Upper Pembina. And one of the recovery actions initiated in 2016 was a fishing closure. The idea here was to give Arctic grayling the population, or the Arctic grayling population, the boost they needed to start recovering, with the intention to report back and discuss with everyone. So tonight we're here to summarize our recovery actions and share information about fish population trends that we've seen in the Pembina River over the last 5 or 6 years, and to increase awareness on this project. So just an overview of how the presentation is going to be laid out for tonight. We'll have a brief touch on the roles and responsibilities of the various government agencies, and we'll talk about the historical status of the Upper Pembina, the approach we took to recovery, and the indicators of success. So what does success look like? What were we looking for during this monitoring period? And we'll also be able to provide current status of the fish within the Upper Pembina, and briefly talk about some of the next steps and get into questions right away to try to answer the questions that are most important to everyone on the line tonight. So a brief look at roles and responsibilities, just to lay things out for everyone. I work for Alberta Environment and Parks. My role is a fisheries biologist. Basically, I evaluate and manage fisheries using objectives and regulations. So what I really do is I count fish, make sure there's enough fish for conservation, and if there's enough fish for conservation, then we try to manage them so that there's fish for Indigenous and non-Indigenous use. There's also the Federal Fisheries Group, Department of Fisheries and Ocean, that leads the habitat program in Alberta. They also work with the Species at Risk Act, and they evaluate risk of developments around water. And then, of course, we have various agencies within the government of Alberta. So one is Alberta Health. They deal with contaminant sampling and consumptive advisories, basically letting us know whether or not we could or should eat the fish. There's also the Approvals Public Lands Group that deals with Water Act approvals, so any kind of developments in and around water within the province. And then, of course, also the Alberta Energy Regulator, and they regulate all things regarding upstream oil and gas around water. So when I say Upper Pembina, what do I mean by Upper Pembina? So this map is giving us an idea of the study area in the Upper Pembina. At the top of the map is Edson. Pembina River is, for the most part, directly south of Edson. It starts in the headwaters, kind of in the subalpine around the Lovett River, flows all the way down to Lodgepole, and that's where the closure ends, is at the bridge near Lodgepole, and includes all the tributaries, including Lovett River, Dismal Creek, Rat Creek, and Paddy Creek. So to get a perspective on the fishery, like on what the fishery could be, we compared to what the fishery used to be. So to get this information, we talked to people who fished around the Pembina during that time. So I say we, it wasn't me or us recently. This was done back in the 90s by a biologist in Edson, where he actually went around and he interviewed some of the folks that are around prior to the 1970s to get an idea of what the Pembina River used to look like. And in those discussions, what we found out that was prior to the 1970s, you could catch at least one grayling in one angler hour, or one hour of fishing with a rod and reel. So that at least one. So if we compare that to 2003, when we sampled the river, if we found out that it was taking closer to 10 hours to catch one grayling with a rod and reel. So as a result of the poor status of the fishery regulations, or the poor status of the fishery, regulations were changed to catch and release in 2004. So fast forward to 2014, we sampled the river again. So this is 10 years after catch and release regulation was introduced. We found out now that it took closer to 25 hours to catch one Arctic grayling with a rod and reel. So this was suggesting that Arctic grayling fishery was at very high risk of disappearing from the Pembina River. So when I say that it's in trouble of leaving the river, so it's a population under pressure. In general, I want to give you guys an idea of what this might look like. So this is just a graph, an example of a fish size distribution. This is not from the Pembina River. This is just for illustration purposes. So what we tend to see in these graphs is along the bottom is the size of the fish, and each one of these bars indicates the number of fish of that size. So at the left, this is where we tend to see the smaller fish or the babies. And as we move to the right, we start seeing the kids, and then we start seeing the young adults, then the adults, and then the seniors, so to speak. What we tend to see is if we have any kind of sedimentation or fragmentation, it tends to affect the recovery of the baby and young fish. So fragmentation is barriers to fish movement. This prevents access to spawning habitats, therefore reduction in babies. Sediment also can suffocate babies and small fry, things like that. Fishing, on the other hand, tends to affect more the adults. So when we're out there angling or any type of fishing that results in a death of fish, that reduces the adults. So sedimentation, fragmentation results in no more babies, loss of resiliency or reduction in the health of the population. And if we have adults dying due to some sort of fishing or any kind of mortality, we have this problem with called growth or recruitment overfishing. So less and less adults resulting in less and less babies, which basically what ends up happening is we're burning the candle at both ends. And as a result, we could have an extirpation of the population or a loss of the population from the watershed. So what is going on in the Pembina River that can be preventing Arctic grayling from recovering? Some road crossings are acting as barrier, preventing fish from moving to and from their spawning areas. These crossings could also be a source of sediment and can negatively affect fish populations as well. We also have other activities within the Upper Pembina that are sources of sediment to the river, and in some cases, the fish habitat is altered, making it less usable or unavailable to fish. Brook trout were stocked into the Pembina River in the past and have since been able to become self-sustaining, which poses or may pose a potential risk to Arctic grayling recovery. By competing for similar space and food within the river, they may even pose a risk as a predator for small and baby grayling. Another activity that can be limiting the recovery is fishing. So since there are very few fish remaining right now, or very few Arctic grayling, any Arctic grayling that dies as a result of fish harvest or catch and release can pose a risk to future recovery. Less adults means less babies. Less babies soon results in less adults, and so on. So what are we doing about it? Why did we do it in 2016? In 2016, we saw an opportunity to try to reverse the decline of Arctic grayling in the Upper Pembina, as many activities that were limiting recovery were recognized, and efforts were being made to reduce these negative effects. Things like the Provincial Stream Crossing Directive. This was set up and running, whereby poor road crossings were being identified and prioritized for fixing, with the Upper Pembina River identified as one of the highest priority watersheds for inventory and repairs in the province. Provincial water regulators, Alberta Energy Regulator and Alberta Environment and Parks, work together to limit water withdrawals based on flows and risk to fish. And as a result, water withdrawals were reduced in the Upper Pembina, with additional restrictions in Dismal Creek, a very important spawning stream for Arctic grayling in the Upper Pembina. Coal mining operations in the Upper Pembina was also completing major remediations in their settling ponds. This too reduced sediment releases to the river during this time. 2 out of the 3 forest management plans were up for renewal. Therefore, we were able to work with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry companies to develop new forest harvest plans that are designed to reduce potential sediment inputs into the Upper Pembina. And knowing that we had 11 years of catch and release leading up to this, with no apparent recovery, we also proposed a fishing closure with the plan to monitor and meet again in 5 years to discuss our findings and potential options moving forward. So this is where we are today. So I said we'd monitor the fishery, but what were we looking for, and what were the indicators of recovery that we were looking for? First and foremost, we were looking for larger fish. So if fish were dying as a result of fishing and we removed that threat, we'd expect that fish already in the system should continue to grow and get older. If fish are dying less, then we'd also expect to continue to see more fish as they grow. And as we see more fish, we'd expect to start to see fish spread out a little bit more and key in on their preferred seasonal habitats, so fish in more places. And finally, as we get more and more larger fish that mature and spawn, we'd expect to start to see an increase in recruitment or more baby and young fish. So these were the 4 indicators that we were looking for during this last 5 or 6 years of monitoring. So how do we evaluate these indicators? We use backpack electrofishing in some of the small streams. It's a very effective tool for catching smaller fish, for catching and releasing smaller fish. We also use sample angling. This is a method that is really efficient, especially at catching Arctic grayling. And it was really key in collecting the amount of data that we were able to in this project because we were able to involve volunteer groups such as Northern Lights fly fishers and whoever was able and willing to come out with us and help us collect this data. We also used raft electrofishing. This is a standardized method we use in the main stem rivers. This is a very good tool for catching and releasing all species. So this was the tool that we used mainly to give us an idea what's going on with most of the other species, especially things like mountain whitefish. So let's consider the 4 indicators of recovery, starting with larger fish. Are we catching larger, older fish after the fishing closure? So for this graph, this is just a graph of the Pembina River prior to the closure. Along the bottom is just the size of the fish, like I showed before. So this is the size of the fish to the fork length, and each one of these bars just represents the number of fish at that size. So fish to the left of the graph are smaller, fish to the right of the graph are larger. And for reference, this line is indicating where immature fish are and mature fish are where fish tend to start to spawn. What we see prior to the closure is mostly adult fish, not a lot of baby fish. And for the most part, these bars are really, really low, indicating a relatively really low abundance of Arctic grayling within the Pembina River, the Upper Pembina in 2014. After the closure, After the closure, we're able to see some of these populations rebound or these bars increase. So as we went through 2018, 2020, 2019, we start to see more and more larger fish stretching out across to the right side of this graph. If we put a measuring bar at Arctic grayling at around 14 inches or 33 centimeters, you could see in comparison to the red bars at the top of the page or prior to the closure, very, very few Arctic grayling were reaching out to this age or this size category, whereas after the closure, we're starting to see larger fish. So this is a positive sign. Although the Upper Pembina recovery effort were initiated because of extremely low numbers of Arctic grayling, all fish species that we can capture on rod and reel should also benefit from the recovery efforts. So we also monitored mountain whitefish. So using the same graphs as previous, smaller fish going more to the left, larger fish going to the right, each bar indicating the number of fish of that size. What we could see is, for the most part, we're seeing some immature fish, so some babies, some kids, and we're starting to see some more mature fish, so some young adults and adults. So a little bit better starting point than Arctic grayling in the Upper Pembina. So remember, the red bars is prior to the fishing closure. So now we're moving on to 2018, partway through the closure. We're starting to see, in this case, these are very interesting results in that it actually looks like there was less fish. What we think happened here was because of the method of sampling was raft electrofishing, and 2018 we've seen really high peak flows that it actually affected our catch efficiency of mountain whitefish during this time. So we went back again in 2019, and lo and behold, those fish didn't disappear. We were just unable to catch them in 2018, and we're starting to see more bigger fish. So comparing the blue to the red, we're starting to see more fish stretch out into the 30 centimeter or 12-inch range in mountain whitefish. Also another positive sign. Of course, we also have brook trout in the system. When we look at brook trout, it's less clear if they're getting larger. We think this may because angling catches we haven't validated angling catches for brook trout yet as to what they mean to the population. However, we may not be seeing the larger fish in these data yet, but what we appear to be seeing to the left of this line is so if we look at the blue and the red bars, they seem to be we're getting more fish in kind of the smaller range. So all in all, it looks like we might be just getting more brook trout a little bit, but we're not necessarily seeing larger brook trout. So let's consider now more fish. We looked at the first indicator. It appears that grayling, mountain whitefish are getting larger. What about, are we getting more of the fish? So when we talk about more fish, what we use is what is called our fish sustainability index, which we use to measure fish status, so what this does is it compares the status of the fishery that you're looking at to a healthy population. And in this case, we use it as an indicator of more fish. So this is basically a report card, fish based on risk to fish. So if we look at the green box, it's low risk, meaning lots of fish. And if we slide down from green to yellow to orange to red to the very high risk category, this would be very, very low fish. So this is what we use to measure the status of fisheries and the number of fish for things like Arctic grayling, mountain whitefish, and bull trout. So if we use this, we use the fish sustainability index, what do we find for Arctic grayling? Historically, we believe that Arctic grayling had a low risk status, that there were lots of fish in the system, and we have the interviews with folks prior to the 1970s that told us this. So this is what we're using. Our current target now is to get to a moderate risk category. We believe this is a more realistic goal than to have it prior to development, I guess. But this is usually our target for most of our fisheries to aim to recover so that we'd have healthy fisheries. Prior to the closure, we had a very, very high risk status of Arctic grayling. There were so few fish kicking around that it was at very, very high risk of being extirpated or lost from the system. By the third year of the closure, it was still at very high risk, but things were trending upwards. And by the end of last year, things are still very high risk, but they're continuing to trend up. So when we do the math, what we found, we have a high probability or a very high belief that the number of adult Arctic grayling have been increasing since 2014. So what does that mean? So at the beginning of this presentation, I talked about pre-closure. So how long it took to catch one Arctic grayling. It took about 25 hours. So now we're looking at closer to 10 hours to catch one Arctic grayling with the rod and reels. This is not ideal, it's not great, but hopefully it's a step in the right direction of Arctic grayling recovery and a positive sign. So indicator 2 for mountain whitefish. We're still looking at more fish using the fish sustainability index. Historically, we thought, or we believe that mountain whitefish were kind of in the high to moderate risk category. So meaning lots of fish or not quite as much as Arctic grayling, but still lots of fish in the main stem. And we're still targeting kind of the same spot. So we're looking at getting back to historic populations of mountain whitefish. What we've seen at the pre-closure was a very high risk, not quite as bad as Arctic grayling, but not doing that great either. By year 4 of the closure, we have trended now upwards to the top end of the very high risk category. So moving in the right direction, but still very high risk. And when we did the math, again, we had a very high probability or belief that adult mountain whitefish numbers have been increasing since 2014. So of course, we have to look at bull trout as well. So I didn't show the numbers of bull trout in a graph like I did for the other ones to see if there's more bigger fish. What we have with bull trout is, so I'll show you this graph and then we'll speak about what was going on with bull trout. Historically, we believe they were moderate risk, similar to mountain whitefish. We're targeting somewhere in the moderate risk category. When we started prior to the closure, they were at very high risk. So probably in more dire straits than Arctic grayling. By the end of the closure, or by the end of year 5, we haven't moved very much off of the very high risk category. I think the arrow's off a smidgen because when we did the math, we have kind of like a moderate probability or belief that bull trout have been increasing. However, we've caught so few bull trout in the system that extreme caution should be used when interpreting these data. What we can say is that we're fairly confident that bull trout are very high risk in the Upper Pembina still. So we used a fish sustainability index to give us an idea of more fish or the status of fish for bull trout, Arctic grayling, mountain whitefish. We do not use that same system for non-native naturalized species such as brook trout because we only use fish sustainability indexes for native species that we actively manage. However, we still completed trend analysis because as recovery efforts such as a fishing closure should also benefit brook trout, we'd expect to see similar results. So what I'm showing here is actually one of the tools that we use to give us an idea with what's going on with trend data. So I've used this for all the fish species. All this is showing is the years along the bottom, 2014 at the far left prior to the closure, the years that we sampled brook trout. Each one of the black dots in vertically going up in a row is just indicating how many fish we caught at each site, how many brook trout. And the blue line is the trend line, which, believe me, it's going up a little bit, but it's really hard to see in this graph. But as you can see, as you go from 2014, 2018, all the way to 2021, you see those black dots kind of creeping up, and you see that kind of smudge plot creeping up. That's kind of giving you an indication of the trend. And when we do the math, we have a high probability or belief that brook trout have been increasing since 2014 as well. So we looked at larger fish, we looked at more fish. Third indicator is fish in more places. As we see more fish, we'd expect to see them spread out more, so we should see them in more places in the watershed. So if we look at Arctic grayling, in 2014, we caught Arctic grayling at 10 of the 18 sites that we angled. For the most part, we were seeing them here in Dismal Creek, our important spawning stream and source population, and hope for the recovery of Arctic grayling in the Upper Pembina, and then kind of in the mid to upper reaches here in the Upper Pembina, kind of in a small little area. By 2018, we caught it in a few more, or 11 out of 18 sites, still throughout Dismal Creek, but we're starting to see them kind of spread out from the center here, upstream and downstream, kind of giving us a little bit more spread on the distribution of Arctic grayling. By 2020, we're starting to see them spread out even more in the upper to the mid reaches, and we're seeing them throughout Dismal Creek. Fairly similar results in 2021, although a few less sites were where we actually caught Arctic grayling. So we didn't catch it in one site in Dismal, a couple sites in the mid to Upper Pembina. We don't believe this is because they stopped distributing or anything. This might have something to do with the conditions we've seen in the Pembina River last year, with really, really hot air and water temperatures, really low flows. So what happens there is fish tend to start to clump up into areas of cooler water and seeking refuge in cooler tributaries, for example, like Dismal Creek. So did we see mountain whitefish in more places? In 2016 was the year that we floated, and we've seen them throughout the entire Upper Pembina, and then throughout, or in a few sites in the Lower Pembina. So, well, in the lower Upper Pembina, as we get downstream of Wolf Lake Road. So we caught them in 19 out of 25 sites. By 2018, we started seeing them in a few more sites downstream of the Wolf Lake Road and still in the Upper Pembina. By 2019, we were catching mountain whitefish at every site that we visited. So starting to see fish in more places. So we still got to keep brook trout in the conversation. And as we look at 2014 here with the red faces, we're looking at 10 out of 18 sites. For the most part, we find them in the headwaters. I think they were originally stuck kind of somewhere in around Crooked Creek, so this is to be expected. And I think we caught one in Dismal Creek that year. 2018, we had similar results in 2018 for the brook trout as we did for mountain whitefish, in that we experienced lower catch rates, and we think it has to do with the flow rates and the ability, or the tool and the method that we used. We were unable to catch fish as efficiently as we were in the other years. So by 2020, though, we're catching them throughout the Upper Pembina and a couple more sites in Dismal Creek, and very similar results in 2020, with the exception of we're catching them at a few more sites in Dismal Creek, and we think that might have something to do with water temperature as well, because Dismal Creek is nice and cool. The water was fairly warm this past summer, and if I were a brook trout, I'd want to live in Dismal Creek too, in the nice cool water. So we looked at larger fish. Fish, for the most part, fish seem to be getting larger. We're starting to see more fish. We're starting to see fish in more places, but are we seeing increased recruitment or more babies? So for Arctic grayling, we're able to use our fish sustainability index for immature fish or young fish. And so for the most part, this is very similar to the adult Arctic grayling. Historically, we believe that they were at very low risk or lots of small immature fish in the Upper Pembina. Again, we're targeting a moderate risk category. Pre-closure was at very high risk, at the very bottom end of the spectrum, so very, very few fish. Partway through, so by year 3, it appears that we were creeping up, getting a few more fish, and by 2020, creeping up a little bit more. So this trend is to be expected to lag behind a bit the adults, because we started in 2014, we started with so few adults that as more and more adults survive, we'd expect this recruitment to increase at a faster pace as adult numbers continue to increase. But for now, what we're seeing is we have a high belief that that young or immature Arctic grayling have been increasing since 2014. So let's look at mountain whitefish. Are there more mountain whitefish babies? Again, historically, they were at moderate risk. We're targeting moderate risk. Prior to the closure, they're at very high risk, but kind of to the high end of the high risk spectrum. So that's good. And by 2020, we have the immature mountain whitefish have shifted all the way into the moderate risk category. So kind of getting closer to where we're targeting them for immatures. And we have a high probability that the immature mountain whitefish have been increasing since 2014. This is a strong recruitment signal and a positive sign for mountain whitefish recovery. So in summary, so we made efforts to address things like sedimentation, fragmentation, and fish mortality. When we're looking for larger fish, one of our first indicators for Arctic grayling recovery, it appears that Arctic grayling are getting older and larger. It appears that we're getting more Arctic grayling in the system. And as we're getting more in the system, it appears that we're starting to see fish in more places. We're also, adult Arctic grayling numbers are increasing. We're starting to see baby and young fish increasing as well. When we talk about other fish, recognizing that Arctic grayling are not the only fish in the watershed, we also monitored mountain whitefish, brook trout, bull trout. Appears mountain whitefish are also showing positive signs of recovery, in that we're seeing larger fish, more fish in more places, and a really strong recruitment signal for more baby fish. Brook trout may not be showing signs of larger fish, however, it appears they're showing to be increasing in numbers and also fish in more places. Bull trout appear to be showing positive signs of recovery, however, very few were captured, therefore caution be taken in these interpretations, but what we can say is bull trout are still at very high risk at disappearing from the Pembina River. So 2021 was a very extreme year. I think we all recognize that. And we had high extreme air temperatures, which resulted in high water temperatures. And couple that with the very low water year that we had this year, we had partial fish kills in some of our East Slopes rivers. And this also included the Pembina River for the most part. The reports of kills were farther downstream of the study area, downstream in and around Lodgepole, where the reports I got. So we believe this is just a stark reminder that it's very important to help recover these species so they're healthy enough to be able to survive these extreme natural conditions. So the word that we like to use is resiliency. We want to build up these populations so they're resilient to extreme floods or extreme droughts, things like that. If we start with very, very few fish and they have to deal with these fish kills, it'll be really hard for them to recover, and we may have issues with extirpation. All in all species are still at very high risk, or for the most part, high risk status. And if the objective is recovery in the Upper Pembina River, especially for things like Arctic grayling and bull trout, then the strong conservation measures are necessary to promote the growth and recovery of this fishery. We're seeing positive signs, and so it appears that we're on the right track to recovery. So next steps. So we're going to continue to get the information out so people are informed and can provide meaningful feedback moving forward. It appears that we're measuring positive signs of recovery in the Upper Pembina according to our success indicators, following a recovery objective which uses restrictive conservation regulations. We're going to continue to work with science groups, Indigenous communities, public stakeholders to discuss potential objectives and trade-offs moving forward, and use management actions to meet these desired objectives. And that's it for me. I'll pass it over to you, Janine.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike, for that wonderful presentation. So we are going to move into our question component of our evening. So I'll invite the panel to turn your videos back on and join us here as we get all set up. And so just a reminder for folks, Jenna is just going to be working in the background on some of the technical aspects, making sure that our meeting's running smoothly for us. So she won't have her video on and won't be part of the panel. But we've got all of the rest of the folks joining us here. So I see lots of folks have found our Q&A tool for this evening, which is great, and are starting to use that upvoting button. So please go ahead and read some of the questions that have been submitted and click that upvote button if you'd like to hear an answer. And as I previously mentioned, we are going to start off with some of our pre-submitted questions, and I see there's a few that are already being asked again tonight, so we'll group those together. So our first question comes from Robert, and it was pre-submitted. And Robert is wondering, what have we learned that can be applied to other East Slopes fisheries?
Janine, I'll take that one. So thanks for the question. That's a really interesting question. So as some of you may know, that we are actively working on recovery of 3 other trout species across the eastern slopes. So that's Athabasca rainbow trout, bull trout, and West Slope cutthroat trout. And so the recovery actions that we're taking for our native trout across the eastern slopes are coordinated through the Native Trout Recovery Program. And of course, one of the most important principles of our recovery program is that we use adaptive management principles. So adaptive management principles basically means that we make a project plan, we implement that plan, we evaluate how it went and what we learned, and then we take those learnings and apply them to our next project. So this is all to say that we've learned a lot through this project, and that there is other possible watersheds that could benefit from a rest period, so that we can see improvements like Mike was talking about, more larger fish, more fish in more places, and more baby fish. However, we don't currently have any on the books right now, but that's something that we can look into in the future. And so I think that we've had a lot of good learnings out of this project, and that we can see that using a recovery rest period is an important recovery action that is useful to improve fish populations. Thanks. Back to you, Janine.
Great.
Can I add on to that, Janine?
Please do, Mike.
So yeah, that's great, Nicole. One of the other things that I think we learned from this project was that collaboration is key and that so what we found was it's not one thing happening in this watershed, and I suspect for a lot of the watersheds, and it's not something that is an easy fix with just moving one lever, or whether it's sedimentation or fragmentation. It requires, for example, to be able to work on many of these limiting factors. And so one of the really cool things that we learned about on this was being able to work with regulators, but more so being able to work with stakeholders such as volunteer groups like Trout Unlimited and Northern Lights Fly Fishers. They're really getting off the couch, so to speak, and helping with their feet, getting their hands dirty in the creek, working on bankside remediation, and just out there helping with us and discussing some of the things going on in the creek, getting a better understanding and providing us feedback and the help actually to collect the data. So that's one of the things I think is key in this project.
Great, thanks, Mike and Nicole. So our next question, I'm actually going to group 3 questions together, so bear with me here while I read them out. The first one comes from Jaden as a pre-submitted question, and Jaden is wondering, when are we planning to open it back up to angling, and what restrictions will be in place? And then we have a question from Andrew that came in live this evening that's wondering, or is saying, sorry, I have never caught any grayling near lodgepole at the mouth of the Rat or Patty Creek in the last 40 years. Will these areas be open soon? And then another question from Don that was submitted live tonight. And Don is saying, the efforts in the past few years to bring recovery are laudable, but it appears there is more work to do before the Upper Pembina can withstand fishing pressure, especially in the day and age of social media, where a good day on the water gets publicized and then can cause excess pressure. Do you intend to keep the watershed closed? And if so, what is the long-term plan?
Mike, I'll see if I can beat you to the punch here a little bit, just because you've had a chance to talk lots tonight as well. But please jump in here, Mike. And so all great questions. Mike, you get to jump in here. I don't know that the answer is cut and dry. I think, Mike, what I saw from your presentation tonight, which was great, and I haven't been here since the beginning of the recovery rest period, and looking at some of the progression of the work that's been done, the volunteers that have been part of that, and the citizen science components across the board. But I think what I saw tonight was reason for optimism. We saw an increase in Arctic grayling. I think we're still in those high risk categories, like Mike indicated. Mountain whitefish, we've seen some increase there. I think we saw an increase potentially. I think Mike indicated a signal, an increase of brook trout and maybe expansion of brook trout. Of course, those are our non-native naturalized species in the watershed. But I think we still have concern with bull trout. So we haven't really seen that signal in regards to increased bull trout numbers. So I think the one thing that we have today, Mike again gets to jump in, is we may have options today, or we're beginning to see options today that we didn't have back in 2016 when we started the closure, in 2014 when we even started about this as an option to recover those species where we were heading to potentially loss of grayling in the system, loss of bull trout in the system, and so forth. So I know all these answers are clumped in there, and I think what we've seen is some of the learnings out of that is perhaps an evaluation of that closure area. Is it appropriate and even more so effective to keep that closure rate to lodgepole? If that isn't going to be an area where we're going to see Arctic grayling, mountain whitefish, bull trout potentially expand and recover into. So I think that's a great comment. I think that's an option that would be on the table that we look forward to hearing more thoughts on. And I hope you keep using the Q&A chat, not only for questions, but to provide us your thoughts on what you saw tonight going forward on those. So in terms of kind of the longer term, I mean, Mike, I might end up getting you a chance to do here. Like I said, I'm glad to see we're starting to have options. Mike, before I do it, everybody hears my poor financial analogies like you. And so I think we're starting to finally see sort of that capital. So we were almost bankrupt. We've built a little bit of capital, which means there's a little bit of interest that we're making. That interest slowly builds when you have a small amount of capital, and I think that's where we're at right now. And now it's a question of, do we start spending that interest? Do we try to keep that reinvestment into capital. And, all within the aspect of knowing that any type of regulation change has to have sort of that multi-species approach. Trying to open it up for one species is going to have to have consideration to the other. Bull trout are our most in peril. Brook trout, we don't have a conservation objective of. We're not trying to, necessarily grow brook trout in the system, but fishing for brook trout is going to have an impact on bull trout and or Arctic grayling and or mountain whitefish. So those are all, I think, the considerations that are out there. So Mike, feel free to argue with me or improve or add upon. So.
Oh, I'm definitely not going to argue with you. No, everything you said was great, Kadon. Yeah, it's basically the way I look at it was this first 5 years was trying to see if we could turn the tide. So flip the switch, get things going the other direction to see if, like you said, if we're going to have any kind of options moving forward. So we kind of tried to shock the system. It appears in a short period of time we were able to do that. So, however, we're still at very high risk. We need to consider, like you said, a multi-species approach. But having said that, all of the fish are at high risk right now that we like and love to go fishing for. So moving forward, if the objective is to recover these fisheries, we're going to need to continue some strong conservation measures, albeit it could be a closure. If any way that we could find to prevent fish from losing that capital so that we could continue to gain more interest. So there's no decisions that have been made yet. We're still having these discussions, working with the science group and having these discussions like tonight so that everyone's informed. So moving forward throughout the year here and the winter, that we could continue to have these discussions and see if and what options we do have available moving forward.
Thanks, you guys. There's a lot of questions all put into one, so thanks for the responses there. So we have one more pre-submitted question from Brody that we'd like to address before we switch back into the live questions here. So Brody was wondering, can we implement a catch and release single hook rule only?
Thanks, Janine. I can answer that. It certainly from process perspective anyway. I think the short answer is yes, we can. Some things to consider are do those objectives or do those changes meet objectives that would that you'd want to achieve for the fishery to protect whatever fish you're trying to protect or improve populations you're trying to improve. So I think there'd probably be an exercise there to have a look at modeling out what the changes as a result of implementing those types of regulations would be. And then there's the regulatory aspect, which is really it's a little bit more complicated in this, but in a general sense, on an annual basis, when we make angling regulation changes in Alberta, the majority of those changes are done in Alberta within the department using what we call a variation order. So we make proposals to go to catch and release or to add a harvest, add a number of fish, do different things. And we can do those within the province and within the department and sign off on those. There are other types of regulations that really are more intertwined with our relationship with the federal government. With if for those, this may come as a surprise to some folks, but the Federal Fisheries Act still actually plays a pretty significant role in provinces and territories in Canada in terms of how inland fisheries are regulated. And so as such, for things like gear changes, barbless hooks, other gear changes, bait restrictions, things like that, we actually have to go take our proposals to the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And generally speaking, that's shown to be about an 18 to 24 month process to put those through. So it is a bit challenging. Can we do it? Yes. For certain ones, it's relatively straightforward. If the modeling suggests that that's a good way to go from a regulatory perspective, we would do it. In other cases, we have to work with our federal counterparts to make those changes over a much longer period of time. Now, all of that said, I should also say that, one of the things that we are currently working on with our federal colleagues at Fisheries and Oceans is to give us a broader suite of tools. In other words, giving us the authority to make many more types of regulations without having to go through that 18 to 24 month period, working with them and doing it through just variation in orders in the province. That hasn't been resolved yet, but we're in talks to do that. So yeah.
Great. Thanks, Shane. All right. So we have lots of great questions coming in this evening. So thanks, folks, for everybody with being so engaged. So our first question that we'll be responding to live, other than the ones that we had grouped with our pre-submitted questions, comes from Kai. And sorry, Kai, if I'm saying your name wrong. But they are wondering, do you think there is a relationship in the incline of brook trout populations and little to no incline of bull trout populations?
Yeah, I could take this one, Janine. So I'm not sure if there's a relationship in the incline of brook trout to little no incline of bull trout. I think it has to do more with that there's just so very few bull trout in the system, and the fact that when there is a bull trout in the system, especially once you get a larger bull trout, they're very, very easy to catch with a hook and line. If they're in the area, you're probably going to hook them. Whereas brook trout, they're not quite as they're not quite as accommodating to hook and line. So I think it has to do more with just starting with so few bull trout compared to brook trout, and most of the brook trout are really small. So we're seeing like some big brook trout are like in the 30 centimeter range, so maybe 12 inches. But for the most part, they're really small brook trout in the tributaries, so they're not really being caught by hook and line. They're in the tributaries, in the headwaters where it's really cool. There's not a lot of sedimentation going on up there. There's not a lot of fragmentation. So for the most part, not seeing a big swing in brook trout populations because of a fishing closure or a reduction in sediment fragmentation isn't not too much of a surprise, because they weren't really being affected as much as, say, grayling and bull trout were, just because of where they live and how often they're willing to take a hook. Hope this answers your question.
Thanks, Mike. So we're going to group two more questions together here, one from a pre-submitted question and then another from Richard here that's come in live. So Richard's live question is, are you concerned that low water levels and high water temperatures will lead to lower fish populations next year? And Shane's pre-submitted question that he had sent in was, what impact did this past summer's heat wave have on fish stocks in the Pembina? I observed many days of dead fish floating by.
I can talk to that. Thanks for the question. Yeah, 2021 did certainly have very high both air and water temperatures, and they could have impacted fish. I know in the Edson area here, we did see pretty substantial fish kills in the McLeod River in localized spots. It certainly wasn't the entire river, but yeah, some areas were certainly saw some fish kills. I'm curious if the question where observing dead fish floating by was occurring within the Pembina River, and if so, where that would be happening, because we did spend a fair bit of time in the Pembina River, and in the Upper Pembina River where we were working, we didn't see a lot of dead fish. I don't think I saw any dead fish floating as a result of the hot weather in those upper reaches. But hot weather can affect fish in a variety of ways. They will try to find thermal refuge. So moving upstream is one strategy, or to deeper pools, trying to get that cooler water. Even some groundwater upwellings that have cool water can provide thermal refuge for those fish. And so we believe that, like in the McLeod River here around Edson, we certainly did see some fish kills happening in the mid to lower reaches. But from all the reports that we've received and from our personal observations, it doesn't seem to be as prevalent in the upstream portions of those watersheds. So, and then the question regarding, will this lead to lower fish populations next year? Well, certainly water levels are low, and as we approach winter here, the overwintering pools might be a bit smaller than usual. However, the impacts from next year will largely depend on weather from next year. If we have high snow loading this year and all of that melts with the freshet, rivers will come up really quickly, and then we'll be into the spring, and then it'll all be dictated by 2022 weather. So a lot of uncertainties there. There is some reason for caution, and we're keeping an eye on things, but fish are adapted to high seasonal changes in climate. So we're hoping that they can be resilient through this.
Thanks, Brian.
And the only thing I was going to add on to your, Janine, is just really thankful that we did get those reports. Janine, you did a lot of that through through My Wild Alberta and through social media. Despite we see some challenges with social media, as we've heard from some of the submitters before, but that was really a great advantage of folks that are following and able to identify to us where they're seeing fish kills. That is helping us get a sense of the magnitude, the numbers, the species, etc. on that. And Ryan, like you said, it was I was hearing mid and lower Pembina. We were hearing on the McLeod. We were hearing across the province on some of our standing water bodies as well. So whether that's going to be an isolated 1 in 25, 1 in 10 heat dome effects, I guess we'll see. I think Ryan, as you said, it goes to I think the piece too of just having resilient fish populations, and a lot of times that's having fish populations still in robust areas as well as in numbers that can withstand some of those acute climate effects, right? So thanks for all the submitters.
Yeah, and I think that's probably just an open invite for anybody on the call. If you ever see fish kills, to please report it to Environment and Parks through any of the channels that we have out there, whether it be social media or our email addresses or anything like that.
Yeah, on that note, if you could provide photos and locations and anything that can help us kind of determine the extent and location of those kills would be helpful.
For sure. All right, great. Our next question here comes from Dan, and Dan is wondering, how does petrified wood affect the decline in the fish populations in the creeks we have studied?
I'll take a swing on that one too. Thanks, Dan. So currently, I don't believe that there is any correlation between petrified wood and fish populations, either inclining or declining. Many of the rivers in the eastern slopes have petrified wood and have healthy fish populations. So hopefully, I don't see a lot of correlation there. But as a petrified wood enthusiast myself, I'm happy to keep taking some anecdotal evidence.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, our next question here comes from Petra, and Petra says there are several conservation or watershed groups working in the Pembina watershed. Are there any priority areas or actions that we could collaborate on, such as riparian restoration on Dismal Creek, remediating water body crossings, or responsible recreation messaging?
So I'm going to be the first to say yes, Janine. I hope folks had their volume turned down. I apologize. Great to hear from you, Petra. I'm not going to know everybody on the call tonight, but certainly know Petra from some of your background on it, and the answer certainly is yes. I think there are opportunities. I think when Mike Ryan made the commitment, when we initiated the rest recovery period, was that it wasn't going to just be an angling closure. And of course that was closure to everybody, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, etc., without other actions that were going to support recovery of fish in those areas. So we know we do hear aspects in regard regards to anglers bearing the brunt of some of the landscape impacts that are happening with development. And so Mike hit on some of those pieces in his presentation there. So I think, Petra, for sure we want to have that conversation. I think what we're seeing is at least on some of the stream crossing program, whether that's also the inspection part, but also the remediation part that's going to be important to that. The Pembina is one of the top 2 or 3 watersheds in the province that we've prioritized for watershed crossing inspection and remediation, and that's part of our coordinated watercourse crossing program that is organized a little bit by AEP, but it's really made up of members of industry at the end of the day that are going to be responsible for that remediation. And then I think as it pertains to the aspect of recreation and starting to do more planning on the recreation piece, which also includes some of the remediation. I know we've done some of that work out of the Rocky Mountain House area. And so where we can involve or other organizations to help with that work. So the habitat side of this, as well as the education side of that, I think that's definitely going to be the part that we want to emphasize, probably even more so than, even than the angling piece, like say, because we've pulled that lever as hard as we can at this point. So Nicole, you would do a lot of the coordinating under the species at risk program provincially. You're seeing a bigger picture than I am. Anything to add to Petra's question there?
Yeah, thanks, Kairon. So one thing I think we can say is that, native trout recovery, whether that be for Arctic grayling or bull trout or whatever, it spans quite a big scale. And so it's something we can't do alone. So we really look to having partners to help us with recovery actions out on the landscape. So we're definitely always looking for more connections and more help to kind of do this work. So it's exciting to hear that there's interest out there for that. And yeah, we look forward to connecting more with other groups that are looking to help us with these recovery actions all across the eastern slopes.
Yeah. So Petra and others, if you've got some ideas or want to participate in some of these aspects, we'll have some contact information at the end of the session here. But feel free to reach out. We'd like to have those conversations and help partners also network with each other in order to be efficient, effective as possible out there. So.
Great. Thanks, you guys. I don't know if Kairon's ever answered a question so quickly, Petra, so great question.
Yes, the answer was yes.
So our next question here comes from Mike, and Mike is wondering if we have estimates of angling effort in the river before and after the closure.
I can take that one, Janine. Thanks for the question, Mike. We do not have accurate data for angling effort in the Pembina before or after. We do have some anecdotal evidence and some locations that we thought angling was higher, that mostly being along the trunk road in the upper reaches, kind of around Fairfax Lake area there, where the road is directly beside the river. Lots of easy access, lots of random camping areas. So we do think that there was fairly high pressure in that upper reach. Shortly downstream of there, the river does become a lot harder to access, and there's some old burns in there, so we don't think that there was a lot of angling in there. But then we are aware of heavy angling pressure, especially seasonally, on some of the bridge crossings in the mid to lower reaches. So there's definitely a fair bit of angling in there prior to the closure. Post-closure, certainly we haven't been doing any sort of big creel surveys on that, but we have had some observance of non-compliance angling within there, but quantifying that right now is very difficult. It's basically, if we have encountered folks angling and have spoken to them and pass them on to enforcement officers as required, but we don't have real numbers on angling pressure in the Pembina.
Yeah, and I could add to that too, Ryan. So yeah, although we didn't have angling effort before or after, what we did know is that there are so few fish that any pressure on them could be stifling recovery, hence the closure. But what we did do to kind of get an idea, so if we wanted to make sure that if the fishery is closed, or we say it's closed, it's deemed closed, are people treating it as closed? So we actually had trail cameras out there watching the river to get an idea on non-compliance. So these cameras weren't out there to try to sting people, make sure that they're getting tickets or anything. But these cameras are out there to give us an idea. So if we don't see any kind of recovery, is it because we're seeing droves of people going fishing it still, or is it actually closed and we're doing the wrong thing? So we, in a sense, we kind of kept an eye on non-compliance in some of the high traffic areas where people were fishing. We actually had help with this through volunteer groups as well. So just to get an idea on whether or not there's people still going to the Pembina. In the first few years, there's a few, and as the closure continued, we've seen less and less people out on the river angling during the closure.
Great, thanks you guys. We have another question from Kai. Again, Kai, sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Why is stocking diploids never a tool in our rehabilitation tool belt?
Mike, are you putting your hand up there, Mike?
I could back you up on that one, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to speak to it more from a kind of a general stocking approach and some of our guidance on that. Stocking diploids isn't completely out of our toolbox. We in fact stocked diploid walleye this year in quite a few places, particularly in the south. We have our recovery programs in particular are looking at developing genetically appropriate brood stock to stock out diploid fish, particularly for initially at least with cutthroat trout, and we'll investigate further genetic strategies for other species at risk as we are able to. So it's not that it's out of our toolbox at all. It's there. We have to also think that stocking diploids, non-natives that have become naturalized fish species, are a good reason why we are in the place we are in right now, and so there has to be careful consideration as to where we would stock diploid fish, what species those would be. But it's not an absolute no for sure. Mike?
Yeah, 100% right. I wouldn't say the stocking diploid tool is off the table. I would say it's on the table. It's always in consideration. For example, if we were to consider it for the Upper Pembina as a restoration effort with Arctic grayling, we like Shane said, we'd have to consider those genetics, but there's a lot more that goes into it as well. It's not as simple as just as spreading fish and hope they take. We have to consider our donor population, like I said, with regards to genetic variation, and also whether or not we have enough that we can borrow from another population. So we don't want to deplete a population, rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. Other things we got to consider are where we're going to restore. Is the habitat good enough, or is it good habitat to bring these fish in? And if it is, what other fish communities are in there? Like Shane alluded to, is we don't want to put fish in an area that might be detrimental to the other fish that already live there. And then of course there's other considerations as to what's the future or long-term plan for that section of river. So all those things have to be considered before we do any kind of stocking of diploids.
I think you guys already maybe answered a lot of Gary's question, but I'm going to read it out. And then if you want to respond or add more to that, then let me know. But Gary's question is, would stocking programs of grayling milked from the same watershed and reintroduced via possibly portable hatcheries from the same gene pool of the Pembina ever be considered, and would it help and give this fishery an added boost?
I think the simple answer is it's being considered. Just has to be considered very carefully, and we also have to temper our expectations on the success of these kind of stocking programs as well.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
so
and
what a great savvy question. Sorry, Shane, too, on it. Like hitting some great pieces in regards to considerations to within drainage stocking, considerations of obviously what we don't want to do is do actions or bring in invasives or anything like that that would be detrimental to the species or the populations. So everything Mike and Shane just said, and Mike, I think you nailed it. It has and continues to be something in our toolbox that we continue to look at across all species, and we will continue to look at that. And Shane, you really said that well earlier. And I think the one thing that we look at is, within that is, are there appropriate stock that we can draw from? And I think also within that, where do we put those resources? And I think, and Mike and I have put our heads together, and Ryan, which is, do we have enough of that capital, that current population there? We see it really strong within Dismal Creek. Is that within itself going to be more than effective or effective enough to actually see that expansion of Arctic grayling and that growth? So we're seeing it. We're seeing those signals for it. Would stocking actually be effective or efficient? I think that's the question we're asking ourselves as well, given all the other things and that can be challenges with stocking that Mike alluded to there as well. So that is not off the table whatsoever. So Shane, you were going to jump in there too. So
yeah, I was going to, that's a good comments, Kate, on, and because I think one of the things we don't want to jump to stocking as the answer, because that often is a place that people go to, right? I mean, as soon as you see a decline in something, one of the first things, intuitively, we all think, well, let's put more in there. Let's make more and put them there, and that'll solve the problem. And it doesn't, because of all these things that we have to consider. But you're right along the right lines in your thinking about getting genetic material locally, making sure that we're following some really considerate approaches, and we're looking at the effects of those things, and there are in fact in places in Canada and out east and in the eastern US and even in Montana, where they're using different variations of that sort of thing, like remote site incubation, incubation of fish, where they remove gametes, fertilize them, put them back in the stream, or there are streamside trailers. Basically, I know I've seen for lake sturgeon where they'll basically pull a trailer up to the side of a stream. They'll pump water through a pipe from the stream through the trailer, and they'll basically put young sturgeon. They'll take gametes and fertilize them and put them back into the stream using all stream water. So there are various things going on, but it isn't the first thing that we want to go to. We want to take other actions and see the response from those populations. So that's probably a little more long-winded than you wanted, Janine, but.
That's okay. Thanks, Shane.
And I want to add one more little thing, Janine. So no,
this is these questions all night.
This is kind of like a little bit of
a good question. It's good
extension to this question. It's a great question. Just so that just to go a little bit further on this, is that when we say that it's definitely a tool in a toolbox, we're definitely telling the truth. So right now we've been collecting DNA throughout the Pembina watershed, and we have some results from a master's student from a few years ago. So we have an idea what the structure of the DNA looks like within the Pembina River. We've also collected through this entire time, and the plan is actually this year to, in working with like Trout Unlimited and Northern Lights Fly Fishers, they've actually secured some funding. We're looking at the genetics within the Pembina River to make sure that if we were to borrow some fish from within, say, Dismal Creek or Rat Creek or something like that, that we make sure that we're actually putting the right genetics in there and we have the proper genetic variation. So we're on the road at looking at these things to make sure that if and when the time comes to do any kind of stocking or restoration stocking, that we're already building these answers.
All right, everybody done now? Anybody else? Thanks, guys. So our next question comes from Raymond, and thank you for being so patient while we get to your question here. What are the mortality rates or percentages expected as a result of the electrofishing studies?
A good question. I'll take that one. Thanks for the question, Raymond. Yeah, so electrofishing mortality can be highly variable. If done improperly, it can certainly be very hard on fish. We take this very seriously. We're well trained and pretty well experienced at it. There are 3 different basic methods of electrofishing, just going up from smaller water with backpack electrofishing to kind of the medium rivers like the Pembina, where we do it with raft, and then going into the larger rivers and even some lake stuff where electrofishing is done with a boat or jet boat. Obviously, as you're increasing the amount of like the size of the gear that's going in there, it can put out a lot more electricity. So that is a consideration. All of our electrofishing in the province is guided by the policy respecting electrofishing injuries to fish, where we are guided by some scientifically reviewed standards to minimize impacts on fish, such as keeping pulse rates down to 30 hertz for salmonid species. The mortality of electrofishing is highly variable, also based on water conditions. So highly conductive water can pass electrons a little bit easier, which can be harder on fish. When we're doing any sort of electrofishing, we're always very careful to watch fish. If fish are swimming away from us and we're not capturing them, we can increase incrementally the output that's going in, so we better capture them. But if we go a little bit too far and fish start to have longer recovery times, then we'll certainly turn that down. Not trying to skirt a number there. You asked for a mortality rate. I'd estimate it at about 1 to 5%. Like if we caught 100 fish electrofishing out of the boat, most of those would be whitefish. Whitefish do tend to be a little bit more sensitive to electrofishing impacts. So if we caught 100 fish, maybe one could succumb to the effects. If it's really warm out, it might go a little bit higher than that, but we do really try to limit mortality from electrofishing.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, our next question here comes from Stephen, and Stephen is wondering, how accurate were the 2014 models? Are populations higher or lower than anticipated? And with a reduction in post-capture mortality, the models should have predicted an increase in population size. What was the slight increase observed since 2014 close to the predicted number in 2014?
Yeah, I could take this one. So for the Arctic grayling in the Pembina River, in 2014, we still we didn't have a model set up to identify. So I assume you're referring to our Joe models and such with cumulative effects. We didn't have the model set up. What happened with the Pembina River was that we had already shifted the regulations to catch and release, and we're kind of at the end of the line with any of the levers we could push. We only had one more thing that we could really do to shift this in the other direction. So I guess what you could say is that we didn't have a model to predict that this was happening. This was our hypothesis that these things are happening, and we're testing that hypothesis right now as we would with the model. So we don't have a prediction as to where the population should be at right now. That's why the data were set out the way they were, just that showing that we'd expect to see these very simple things, bigger fish, more fish. Currently, right now in the province, we are developing we're working towards developing our Arctic grayling models. We have the bull trout model. There's so few fish, we're unable to predict or tell what's going to happen with bull trout in the Pembina River right now. But with regards to modeling, no, we didn't have a model at the time, and so we're unable to predict and see where we're at with that model yet to test the model.
Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
Our next question comes from Jeff. What other watersheds are you considering closing so that they may also recover?
Well, I can take a bit of a regional view on this. Shane, I might ask you to jump in too. And Nicole, you kind of addressed this earlier when we talked about all the different actions that are in the toolbox, if you will, in regards to recovering populations. So, so I guess the piece is I don't know that I don't know that there's anything out there in regards to proposals for recovery rest periods for the next year. I think ultimately a closure or recovery rest period really, it's designed for a couple things. One is we're at such a conservation issue in terms of potential extirpation of a species that we need to immediately stop that decline and then facilitate recovery. Or the second might be where we've done something like restoration stocking. So we're trying to recover species and there needs to be a closure for that growth of that restoration to actually perpetuate that way. And then at the point where we see expansion or recovery, then we can allow fishing on some of those pieces. So, as we look at all these different watersheds across the slopes, but even more broadly than that, I think it's really the last consideration when we think about closure to angling, because obviously that has, we aren't here to take away opportunities, is never the intent. Our anglers are our stewards out there. So our Indigenous and non-Indigenous users, they're the eyes and ears on the land. A lot of times they help John many times in terms of being the eyes and ears out there. So when we consider that, it really does mean we're coming here with a conservation concern, or again, it's to facilitate the recovery of a species on those, on those. So we have talked about the use of those in those areas where we might have continued conservation concerns, but I think really what we're trying to do is make sure we're filling in all of that picture that, again, Nicole talked about. Are we addressing habitat? Are we addressing hybridization? Are we addressing these other pieces before we pull those final levers? So, it kind of speaks to what the status was of the Upper Pembina that required, that lever to be pulled, as well as the commitment to work on those other pieces in regards to forestry, in regards to water crossings, in regards to water withdrawal, all those things that Mike, Ryan, others have been involved in. So Shane, I'll see if you have anything to add from the provincial scope on those pieces. Again, it is in our toolbox. It's something we rarely ever want to use, right? So.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I think what you've said really, it does apply universally across the province. Those are all the things we would consider, and it is really a last lever that we want to pull in terms of apps closing to fishing. It's not something we want to do because we are also conscious of when we take those actions that the people that fish there and depending, there's variable angling pressure everywhere, but they're going to go somewhere else. And so, we definitely do not take those decisions lightly. It's a tool in the toolbox and we will use it, but there are probably some other tools I would say that we would consider as well, potentially, before getting to that point. And it might be partial limitations, or it might be some other tools in the future that we develop that might help support some of the fisheries and still be able to have a conservation focus.
Great, thanks guys. So just looking at the time, it's 8:22, so we've just got a few minutes left here, but we'll sneak a few more questions in. So the next one comes from Jean-Pierre. Since the closure, fish population seems to have recovered slightly, will there be more riparian work scheduled, such as willow planting or bank repair?
I can take this one. So yeah, it's there's I don't know of any that is planned right now. For the most part, that is done through groups like Trout Unlimited and stuff. Usually what happens for bank repairs is first we have to identify the banks that are degraded, that need repairing, and then we develop projects to do that. We don't need a population like the Pembina River to do that. Typically those are smaller scale kind of projects. So whenever they come across them, or obviously we would try to make sure that they're happening in places where they're needed the most, like similar like the Pembina River. We've done some, and I say it wasn't me, it was Trout Unlimited, Northern Lights Fly Fisher have done some of these in Dismal Creek in the Pembina River. So yeah, we're always on the lookout for these projects to continue to do good things for habitat for fish.
Just a 30-second plug on it too, Mike. So you don't have to be part of a group to necessarily be effective and assist in recovery. I think what happens a lot of times, so why we end up partnering with Trout Unlimited, with the Alberta Conservation Association, with watershed advisory councils, et cetera, on that, is there are some approval processes that can be in the mix on some of those pieces. And the other part is of course, we want to coordinate where it's going to be most effective. And then we'd like to, as best as we can, is protect that recovery work, that habitat remediation work that we do. And sometimes that can be leveraged through organizations more so than individuals. But if folks have ideas individually or organizationally, we're open to hearing them. So some of the same comments I think Nicole and I provided with Petra's question earlier. So.
Great, thanks. Another question here from Stephen, and Stephen is wondering, have there been any brook trout and bull trout hybrids observed in the Pembina?
Oh, good question. So we have observed some hybrids in the Upper Pembina, and we have recently confirmed those with a genetic analysis. As far as we know, it's really hard to tell what proportion there is, but yeah, we have seen a few.
Great, thank you. So our next question here is from Heath, and Heath is saying, I'm interested to know what, or if any, was known regarding the predatory nature of brook trout towards the Arctic grayling before they were released into the watershed.
That's certainly a fair question. I can take that one. Unfortunately, I don't believe that there was a lot of pre-thought into that. The brook trout stocking into the Pembina River, as much of the Edson area came as the rail line and coal mines were developed in the 1930s through the 1950s. There was a large influx of people moving out west from the east to go get these jobs at coal mines and development of the rail lines. And reading through some of the old reports around here, they were unhappy with the fisheries that existed at the time coming here, and wanted fish that they were more familiar with, like brown trout and eastern brook trout. So they shipped those via rail from Ontario out here and placed them all over the landscape. Some populations took hold better than others, but competition with native species in Alberta was not really a consideration at the time. So it is an issue that we deal with across the landscape for many different native species.
All right. So just one more question here that will go before we have our closing remarks. So this one comes from Paul. And Paul is wondering, with the 2021 issues of both water and air temperatures, will this introduce the warm water species of pike and walleye into these areas? If it does, what will this do to the present fish populations?
Yeah, I could take this one. Rivers through time get hot, they get cold. There's always this transition zone in a river from cold to cool water species like pike and walleye. So we tend to see that once we kind of get downstream of Wolf Lake Road in the Upper Pembina. So we're already kind of sampling in that area. I don't think they're getting introduced. They live there. You see them wander into the headwaters, and you see cold water species wander downstream. If anything, it could be, you might see seasonal distributions. So with water and air temperatures on an annual basis like this, I wouldn't expect to see reintroduction. Perhaps maybe what you're talking about are things like global warming and stuff. That would be a totally different story. Of course, if we get really, really warm water moving upstream as a result of global warming or something like that, that would be a totally different river and a different habitat. But with like heat waves like this and droughts and floods, I wouldn't expect to worry about there be an influx of pike, say, in the headwaters of the Pembina River just because of a few years of hot water.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to close us off for this evening. So I'll just pass it over to Kate on if you want any final remarks before we go through our few closing slides that we have.
Sure. Thanks, Janine. I just wanted to quickly thank the panelists tonight for a great presentation, Mike. We were represented tonight by Fish and Wildlife Policy, by our Species at Risk section, as well as the district biologists who do gather the data, bring the things that we saw here tonight for discussion on that. And of course, Janine, you and Jenna as our education engagement leads, and John, you as our partner in Fish and Wildlife Management on the enforcement and compliance side, as well as education. And really thank everybody for attending tonight and giving up part of your evening to share with us. And I guess, Janine, my only piece and what I'd really encourage folks to do is tonight was really meant to be, it went so fast. It really is meant to be the start of a conversation. So we only had a chance to get back to you guys on maybe one of your questions. Really encourage you to contact any of us. Mike and Ryan certainly know the most on the Pembina, but if you have questions that weren't answered tonight or didn't get to, please follow up. And let's continue the conversation, whether that be on the phone, through email, those things. I think Mike said it earlier, there's nothing prescribed. Tonight really was, us providing information 5 years after the implementation of the recovery rest period, where we're at. We talked and indicated that maybe there's some beginning of options that we didn't have 5 years ago. And we want to continue to hear from you. There were some really good suggestions and conversations tonight. So we look forward to following up with folks on that. And that'll continue right up until, as part of our regulation cycle and review of our regulations across Alberta, that kind of happens over the next couple of months with engagement on many of those regulation pieces that we anticipate doing in January. So with that, Janine, I'll hand it over to you. So
great, thanks, Katon. So I think too, as you mentioned, Katon, this is really just the start of a conversation. And so we have lots of opportunities to chat with folks throughout, the next few months. This was just the beginning of the conversation. So if you are on Facebook, I would recommend following our Facebook page at My Wild Alberta. We post lots of really great things on there showing what our biologists are doing throughout the year and all of those different things. So follow us on there. And of course, you can find lots of additional information on alberta.ca and mywildalberta.com. So check that out. And if you have any follow-up questions for us, then always please feel free to reach out. So after the webinar is finished, you will automatically be redirected to a webinar survey. So this is just one of the sessions that we're hosting this fall. We have our Bow River session next week on November 3rd at 7 p.m. But we'd like to hear about your experience and if you found tonight useful for sharing all of the information that we did and as a platform to be able to interact with our biologists. So please fill out that survey as we would like to hear from you on tonight's session. And then lastly, again, like Katon said, we'd really just like to thank you for spending time with us. And if you do have questions that weren't addressed tonight, you can see Mike's email on the screen here. So please feel free to connect with him directly for any follow-up questions that you may have about the Pembina. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you into the future. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us. That brings our session to a close. So we hope you all have a great evening and we'll be in touch with you soon. Bye, everybody.